So I was doing my usual perusing of the internet this morning, and I came across something that I found very interesting and thought would make a good topical video here. An interview I saw with Jeremy Boresh where he talked about one thing if he could change about TNA, the one thing he would change above all else if he was in charge was that he would have TNA move over to the UK permanently on a full-time basis because he feels the production values are better there, obviously the crowds are larger, and he thinks ultimately that it would be a good thing for the company and the product and the brand for the now and especially for the future. And I thought that was very interesting to hear him say that. Now, in my opinion, I think TNA's biggest problem is their inability to market and promote and effectively advertise their product. That's just me. But I could see where Jeremy Boresh is coming from. And frankly, there's some logic to what he's saying here. The fact of the matter is, you're talking about a TNA now that records their television shows at an amusement park. Let's face it, that's what Universal Studios is. They do it at a studio at an amusement park where people don't even have to pay their own admission, I believe, to actually get into the show. It's just one of the attractions for the venue as a whole. When they go on the road and they do their live events, they're a lot of times performing in front of 200 or 300 people, doing it at high school gyms and what have you. They're drawing less than 1,000 people to their pay-per-views. Things aren't good from a TNA standpoint. You look at TNA's television ratings, they're not good from any standpoint. And then you look at the UK and you see when they go over there on their yearly tour, they're drawing big gates, they're getting big numbers, 5,000 people, 8,000 people, 10,000 people, if not more. And absolutely, it comes across better on television. It makes the product feel more major league. It ramps up the overall production value for those watching it at home on television. Instead of seeing it in the same old small ass looking studio, this is in a big venue. This feels major league. And furthermore, I think it puts the pressure on TNA to actually try to ramp up what they do to justify having a show that goes in a venue, having a show worthy of a venue instead of just having a venue that needs a show, which is something different. I also understand too, from a bottom line standpoint, you're looking at it and you're saying, hey, if we could draw 5 or 10,000 people here when we go once a year, imagine if every event we did, we even drew 1,500 or 2,000 or 2,500 as opposed to the 2, 3, 500 that we're drawing now. That has to be good for business. That has to be good for the overall bottom line. And in theory, that makes sense, and I would agree with that. You also look at it from a standpoint of TNA has a nice size following in the UK in part because of the type of channel and television deal that they have, the channel that they appear on, as opposed to the premium service that WWE is a part of with Sky Sports. That helps make them more a show of the people, if you will, and not quite as uppity. And that may sound stupid, but there's actually a logic and a reasoning to it. It does make sense. TNA has the potential to reach more households, therefore more eyeballs on the product, therefore feeling more like a show for everybody. And that's just the way it is. So again, there's a lot of appeal here, not to mention the fact that I think the domestic interest in professional wrestling here in the States is dwindling. It is an eroding art form here in this country, and the business isn't doing anything to help that. The wrestling companies aren't doing anything to really help that. It's just the interest in it is eroding. It is a dying um, and decaying, if you will, art form here in the United States. So the company that is best able to expand into the international market and grow their audience and following there, I think is going to be better positioned 5, 10, 20 years from now for long-term success. So again, I get all of those things. There are arguments to be made for it. There's no question. But I have some concerns about it. To me, I think it might be taking something that you see occasionally and assuming automatically that it would apply across the board. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Maybe part of the reason that TNA draws 5 or 10,000 people when they go over there for the UK tour is the fact that they're on television there year round, but they are ultimately only there, once a year. They do one tour a year. Maybe that's part of the appeal. You don't get to see it that often. We got to go see it. If you're there now all the time, you don't have that same appeal. You don't have that same uniqueness. And as a result, it starts to feel repetitive after a while. And that's where the real challenge comes in for a TNA that over the years has done such a poor job of marketing, promoting, and advertising your product. Eventually, if you didn't fix that, which I feel is still TNA's biggest problem by far, eventually you're going to create an environment where it's going to be the exact same as it was in the States. Not to mention the fact that you have a much smaller potential audience in terms of number of people and in terms of geography, in terms of sheer square mileage, than you do in the United States easily. And also think about it this way too. If you go over to the UK, you pretty much on a permanent basis, you're saying, almost, up yours to the States, and you're saying screw you to the United States wrestling fan. And then maybe you're only able to appear once or twice a year, and you are ostracizing a huge potential segment of your wrestling fan base. Now are you going to sit there and say, well, if we come over once or twice a year, we might be able to draw some huge gates at some bigger venues? You could, but then look at it from a standpoint too of, Spike TV deal with TNA is coming up very soon, hasn't been renewed yet. Would a Spike TV or any other network for that matter really want to enter into a long-term, any sort of lucrative television deal with a wrestling company that's not even stationed here in the United States, over there in the UK, basically a British wrestling company, if you will? As a result, knowing that every show is going to be taped, every pay-per-view is going to be taped, knowing that there's not going to be consistent ground troops, if you will, to help try and grow that brand here domestically in the United States, you could be setting yourself up for some issues with the television deals. Also, you look at it too from a standpoint of, if your guys in TNA live in large part off of the money they make on the independent scene, which is absolutely the case, if you went over to the UK on a permanent basis, again, how are those guys going to make a living? I can't imagine that overall in the UK they would have as many independent promotion and as many avenues to make money as they do here in the States. Not to mention the fact for these guys that maybe like the Rudes and the Storms of the world, how willing would they be to go over there and work at the UK on a full-time basis with families here? Would they really want to move their families over there? Are you prepared to deal with the issues that come along with the work visas for a lot of these guys that aren't British, English citizens, let's say? There's all these different issues, and while it sounds great in theory, it potentially opens up a whole new can of worms that I have fears that a TNA would be well equipped to deal with. Now, don't get me wrong, it sounds great on the surface to sit there and say it's got to be better for business to wrestle even in front of 2,000 people a few times a week as opposed to 200. And yes, it does. But if you don't fix the things that you've done wrong here in the States, and then you go over to the UK and you repeat those same mistakes, eventually you've managed to ostracize and eliminate the United States fan base, and you've basically done the same thing you did in the States with the UK. So it's kind of like that. What's that saying? You put a lipstick on a pig, it's still a pig. You could spray all the potpourri around a pile of shit that you want, but it still smells like shit. I'm just saying. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some merits to it, but I have some concerns about it, and I don't think it's really feasible or viable for a TNA at this point in time to be able to do this, nor do I think they have the ability to properly execute on something like this or be this aggressive to make this type of huge leap or huge gamble, even though there could be some good reasons for them to do it. Now, would I be completely in favor of and advocate for them doing more UK tours every year, maybe doing 3 to 4 of them? Oh, absolutely. If a TNA tries to tell me or other people like me that it would be very cost prohibitive to do that, I would ask why. How would it be cost prohibitive? If you talk about travel expenses and everything else, that's one thing. But at the end of the day, performing in front of 5,000 people, 10,000 people every couple of months, or sitting there and performing in front of 2, 3, or 500 people, and then performing in front of people that don't even pay specifically to get into your show at an amusement park's attraction, at a studio, at Universal Studios. How would it be cost prohibitive? You would think at the end of the day, unless you terribly mismanage your situation and you just completely botch the execution of everything, that you could make more money making more appearances in the UK, making the UK fans happier because they would get TNA more without getting into the area of maybe giving them too much where they start to turn away from it. I think there can be some compromise here. I do think TNA needs to go over there more. I think it would be something that would be beneficial for all parties involved, the wrestlers, the executives of the company, the overall business and bottom line. I think from the fan standpoint, both here in the U.S. and Canada and overseas, I think it's a win-win for everybody. But I want to hear from you. I want you to let me know. Do you think it would work if a TNA moved to the UK on a full-time basis? Do you think American wrestling fans would support a wrestling company that was primarily stationed out of the UK on a consistent basis? Would it work on United States primetime national cable television? Talk about all these things in the comments. Let me know if you agree with me. Let me know if you agree fully or disagree fully with Jeremy Borash and why. I would sit there and tell you to do a video response, but for some reason, YouTube got rid of the video responses on video forum. Makes no sense to me. But I will say it at least makes some sense to have this discussion when it comes to TNA, because I do think it's something that TNA needs to do. Grow their international business, become more of an international brand, and ultimately, I think, help save their company, frankly.